Okay, so we arrived to the late but most important part of the workshop, the keynote lecture that we have today. I welcome also our viewers online for the lecture. It is really my pleasure in the name of everybody here and the organizers, Evelyn and Katarzyna, to welcome our keynote speaker, Professor David Farrell, who is Professor of Politics at the University College London. He's also the... Dublin. Sorry. I had it written here, sorry. President of the ECPR, right, the European Consortium for Political Research. To be honest, I cannot think of another scholar that perhaps has, so many common interests with Peter, in the sense that both of you have worked on electoral systems, political parties, deliberative democracy, EU democracy, which of course, other scholars have also wrote about, but also Irish politics. So you have, this special connection in terms of this. You were at the initial, let's say, project, right, of the cartel party in 1992, right? So, we are really honored that, you have accepted our invitation to deliver this keynote speech that is titled "Party Democracy Meets Deliberative Democracy?" ? The floor is yours, David. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Fernando, and thank you very much for the invitation to come. And it's wonderful to see you, Karen. Thank you particularly for turning out. That really means a lot. I'm really honoured to have been invited. I'm really honoured to have been invited to. If you close that window, I'll kill you. Sorry, Evelyn. It's been a long, sweaty day. I don't know what the Prime Minister of Italy is talking about in terms of no need for air conditioning in this climate.
It's deliberative democracy.
It's deliberative democracy. Sorry, Evelyn. I'm really honoured to have been invited by all of you to speak. I'm very intimidated. Listening to the presentations and the discussions earlier on, I really feel Peter all the way through. It's not just that you're name-dropping Peter all the time, but you really are speaking the language of Peter Mair. And I guess we all share that in common because he influenced so many of us in so many ways. I just remembered I should put my PowerPoint slide on. Sorry. Give me a sec. The reason I shouted at Evelyn is because I'm melting here. I was in Reykjavik a few days ago, and the contrast is quite scary. So I want to start with a bit of an apology because this is a presentation that doesn't really have a proper ending. And in a way, I'm sort of looking forward to the discussion if you stay awake long enough to get a sense of possible angles that I might pursue. And the context for this really is the first time I was here in this very room, which was about 2 months ago, for a meeting that Daniela Karamani and Calypso Nikolaidis was organizing of a potential Horizon application, hopefully a potential Horizon grant that's just gone off, in which, if we're successful, my brief will be to look at the theme of deliberation within political parties. And so what I welcome about this, as will become apparent in a short while, is that this is allowing me the chance to bring my research agenda back a little bit, because I've spent the last 12 years of my academic life focused on deliberative mini-publics. You're going to hear a lot about deliberative mini-publics, I'm afraid, in the next half hour or so. And I'd left party politics behind me, but I'm sort of hopeful that this Horizon project, if it's successful, will bring us back to that. So, sorry, I'm not used to. So let me start with a little bit about Peter. I first met Peter in 1983 at the Badia. There was nothing else but the Badia in those days. I was a 22-year-old. It was my first time living outside of Ireland. It was my first time living away from my own home, from my parents' home. So I was hitting the ground in all sorts of ways and discovering life in a way I hadn't appreciated before. And Peter was, I guess, about 30, 31 then, would be my guess. I think he was about 9 years my senior. And he was an assistant professor. He and Stefano were assistant professors. Luciano was there as well. They were assistant professors, so they didn't have much status. They couldn't supervise students. They were still working on their own PhDs. But they clearly were so incredibly talented. It was obvious to anyone who spent even 5 minutes in their company that the Badia decided to give them a status, and that was to allow them to run, to be given the title assistant professors, and to run a seminar series. And just imagine, I mean, I know we all have different generations represented in the room, so some of this may be familiar enough to you, but this was before email, this was before Google, this was before somebody could send you a file on the computer. This was the days of where you get a big pack of readings. And they ran a seminar series called the West European Party System. And that book remains one of my favorite books to this day because it brings back so many memories of that seminar series that they ran. And maybe it evolved over time. I imagine it probably did beyond Western Europe in due course. But in those days, 1983, that's what the focus was. And it was an incredible seminar series. We'd be in a room like this, no air conditioning then either. And people would be coming and going. You know, one week it was Morgans Pedersen. I remember the day they had Karl Deutsch. What an amazing moment that was to sort of spend time in his company. I don't know, we had drafts of papers by Ronald Inglehart that had been sent in the post, or by Scott Flanagan and Russ Dalton. So the different people coming and going all the time. And the way it was run, it was probably the same in your day, was Peter or Stefano would say, it's your turn next week. Here's something you need to read, and you critique it. So I was given this new book. I was asked to critique a book that had just come out. And, you know, I'm 22 and I'm ambitious and I'm going to prove myself. And so I went for it. I found all the errors. I was highly critical of the study. And as I was talking, Peter was sort of sitting where Evelyn is now, and the grin on his face, he was a very naughty person, as we all know, was growing ever larger, because sitting in front of me, next to Peter, was somebody who looked like that at this stage. I had no idea who that was, except that it was somebody who was getting increasingly irritated the more I spoke. And of course, I finished. And then Peter turned to the author of the book that I'd been asked to read, A Theory of Parties and Electoral Systems, Dick Katz. I'm rusty, I'm not used to public speaking. Give me a while to get into this. A Theory of Parties and Electoral Systems, Dick Katz. And I completely got it wrong. It was obvious I got it wrong. And Dick was wonderful. He met me for coffee the next day and by Dick standards, very politely corrected every single one of my misinterpretations. And we became good friends. And, you know, many of you I know will know Dick very well to this day. So we became good friends. And particularly, Fernando mentioned this, it was this project. When Peter passed away, Karen very kindly donated his book collection to my university department. So we have the Peter Mair Library, which I hope someday you'll all come and visit. And it includes papers. So I was going through these papers last summer, and I came across this, and I remember this paper, but I had thrown out my copy. The original application by Katz and Mair for the original party organization project. And, you know, the seminar included Luciano would come along to it, Thomas Baguntke, Paul Webb, and we all got invited to be on that project. I was Ireland, Thomas was Germany, you were Europe, and Paul was Britain. So friendships were forged. You know, we worked closely together for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. In the mid-1990s, I was setting up party politics with this colleague, and I was writing around to people saying, you know, we got this new journal we're starting up. Anyone got any spare papers that you might want to send us? Peter and Dick sent us the Cartel Party paper. Can you imagine you're about to launch a new journal and you're presented with that paper as the first paper of the first issue? We were in the top 10 in the Thompson series for about 4 or 5 years as a result of that. Excuse me. I'm still a bit nervous. I'll get over this. I will in a minute. But so, you know, Peter meant an awful lot, but I drifted away from him for a period. He moved to Italy after the Netherlands. I stayed in Britain. And I didn't see him for a very long time. And this was the last time I saw him. The Mcgill Summer School. So this is a summer school in which policymakers come and they talk about sort of things going on in Irish politics. And this was 2011. This was late July 2011. And Peter was on, excuse me, I'm doing what you did once. I'm getting a bit emotional about this, but I'll get over it.
I do it all the time, so.
Peter was on the same platform as myself. And what he was talking about was, the state of Irish politics, the crisis in Irish politics. This was 2010. We were going through the depth of the recession. Anyway, that was the last time I saw him. So, a few weeks later, I got the word that he'd passed away. So, Peter was talking about the state of Irish politics. I was talking about the state of Irish politics. Evelyn earlier on mentioned that we were one of the pig states. We were one of the states that was impacted very heavily by the economic crash of 2008, 2009, 2010. And what had happened is I had just come back to Ireland, and we had fallen off a fiscal cliff. The country was in a mess. It wasn't the first recession, but it was the worst recession in the history of the state. Huge unemployment, public sector salaries being cut, a lot of anger in the street, a huge amount of anger in the street. The country was on its knees. And this is what Peter was reflecting in his talk. But what I was reflecting was something else, which was an episode that happened a few years earlier. Ken Carty, whose name came up yesterday, or today, sorry, this is the first day, isn't it? Yeah. In 2003, I got an email from Ken saying, David, we're having a discussion in British Columbia about electoral reform. We've got a bunch of citizens together to talk about the electoral system for the province of British Columbia. And they're reading your textbook on electoral systems. So we thought you might like to come and talk to them. So this was the Citizens' Assembly on Electoral Reform of British Columbia that was set up in 2004, 2005. And it was followed very soon after. That was Ken Carty, a political scientist. A few years after by, how do I go back on this thing? By one in the Netherlands, Henk van der Kok. This was the Burger Forum on electoral reform in the Netherlands. And a few months later again in Ontario, Jonathan Rose, another political scientist, also a research director, also on electoral reform, all three using my textbook. So I had this unique experience of a party politics electoral systems person being invited to talk to ordinary citizens about electoral systems. And it was the most incredible experience of my life. I do not exaggerate. I mean, can you imagine? You've got 160 odd citizens who've not only read your book, but they've read all this other material as well. They knew more than any student I've ever taught about electoral systems, about de Hont and Saint-Lagou and district magnitude and, effective number of parties. They knew this stuff because that's what you get in a citizens' assembly. You get this incredible moment where citizens are being brought up to speed. They're hearing from experts. They're hearing the arguments in favor of a proposition. They're hearing the arguments against a proposition. And they're being asked by their government to come forward with some recommendations. So each of those three made recommendations on how to change the electoral system of the case that they were looking at. So that was my first foray into this theme of deliberative mini-publics. What do I mean by deliberative mini-public? So deliberative mini-public, the essence of it is you get a random selection of citizens. So it's like jury duty. The citizens are selected randomly. It's a stratified process. You get gender balance and regional balance and age balance and all of that. And they are brought together for a period of time and brought up to speed by the experts on the topic that they have to discuss. So it's informed discussion. And then they sit in small tables. Most of the work is done in small tables for facilitated deliberation. So the idea is everyone has equal voice. The idea is nobody's dominating. The idea is that everyone has an opportunity to say their piece. And then in the end, they produce a set of recommendations. That's the essence of what a deliberative mini-public is. And so that was 2004, 2005, 2006. So we flash forward a little bit now. This is what I was talking about on the stage next to Peter at Mcgill Summer School. Because a month earlier, we had organised, a bunch of us, Ireland's first Citizens' Assembly. And what happened was 2010, the country was on its knees, so the political scientists as a community in Ireland decided, we got something to contribute. We know a little bit about institutions and institutional reform. And one of the arguments as to why the country was on its knees was because the system had failed, the politicians had failed. So our rationale was, let's provoke a debate about reform. That's what we wanted to do. A little bit ambitious, but we decided we're going to give it a go. And so we got substantial funding from a philanthropist to set up this organization which we called We the Citizens. It operated for a year, but its main thing was to run a weekend-long citizens' assembly in Dublin in June of 2011. And so I was presenting some of our findings at the Mcgill Summer School. And it was a bit like a deliberative poll. We didn't call it a deliberative poll because to do so means you have to engage with James Fishkin, a wonderful colleague, and I'm sure it would have been great to engage with him, but we didn't particularly want to have anyone else involved. If you know anything about deliberative mini-publics, you know what I'm getting at there. So what I mean by a deliberative poll, or the sort of thing that we were doing, was it was a controlled experiment. So we had 100 citizens together in a room for that weekend discussing a number of topics. We had another bunch who weren't in the room, who we didn't interfere with at all. We had a third bunch who were sent the briefing documents that these guys were sent. So we had different control groups. And the object was to try and show that involvement in this Citizens' Assembly had an impact over and above any other impact that might have been involved in any other process of intervention on those 100 citizens. And we knew that we would get a measure, and we got that measure because we know from the literature that that's the case. And the reason I put that little prompt to remind myself in red there, academic activism, is because, in a sense, what happened at this moment in my life was I fell down a rabbit hole as far as my colleagues, my tribe of party politics people was concerned. Because I started getting involved in academic activism. It wasn't just me, there were others. There was Jane Souter and Owen O'Malley and a couple of other political scientists in Ireland who were part of this project. But we were part of a group. We didn't know about it then. But I was scribbling down some of the names of people I was to get to meet. So in Belgium, Yves Deja, I can never pronounce the name properly, Dejager, Min Roychamps. In Britain, Alan Rennick and Graham Smith. In Australia, Nicole Curato and Simon Niemeyer. Yves Sintemar in France. And there were lots of others. And what we shared in common as we got to know each other was that we'd sort of done what I know many of you, or the rest of you probably have done at some stage. We came out of the academy. We very deliberately came out of the academy and wanted to intervene in a debate in national politics. And our mission with We the Citizens was to persuade the government that they should set up a citizens' assembly that should be funded by the government. And that's what happened. Not only did it happen, but it sort of went a little bit further than we could have dared to believe, because they've now set up 5 of these things. So the first was called the Convention on the Constitution, and then there's been followed by a whole series of others. The 2 most recent ones are ongoing, the Dublin and the biodiversity ones. The Dublin one was only meeting yesterday for the most recent time. And others are promised on drugs use and future of education. There's even the Sinn Féin party are even talking about having one on a United Ireland. So it's really happened on a scale we could never have predicted. And when I say it's really happened, here are the headline outcomes of these deliberative processes. So Ireland became the first country in the world to vote for marriage equality, for gay marriage, as a product of the recommendations of the Convention on the Constitution. Ireland also voted to dramatically liberalise our abortion legislation and to get rid of a ban in our Constitution in 2018. That followed recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly, and you can read yourself the other ones. Now, I do not want to pretend that this has been perfect, and I'll come back to some of the points later on, but the gist is that not all the recommendations of these processes have been accepted, but a certain number of them have been accepted. And so now I want to, in the time I've got, and I'll try and not go too long, I want to address 2 questions. The first is the so what question. What Peter might say if he was here. I imagine what Dick would say if he was here, because Dick is always the more direct of the 2, in my memory at least. The so what, you can run these things. It may be that some changes did follow, but in the British Columbia, Ontario, and Dutch cases, no changes followed. All of the referendums in British Columbia and Ontario failed, for example. So what? And, you know, Peter was aware of these things. I know the Ruling the Void book was published posthumously, so I refer to these earlier pieces because I think a lot of them went into the book. But this was a piece in 2006 where he talked about deliberative processes being, among other democratic innovations, rather exclusive. He said that they were not offering much real scope for conventional modalities of democracy. And he wasn't the only one. You know, here's just a tiny sample of many other authors who've said the same thing. Carol Pateman, it's not integrated in their book on whatever they call it, Democracy for Realists. Aiken and Bartels are in a footnote, I think on page 4, if I remember. Just get rid of it. They just say it's not really relevant. So that's the sort of gist of these things. You know, people, whether in the mainstream of party politics or more generally in comparative politics, aren't exactly big fans. And the essay I love the most on this is Van Biesen and Sayward in their Political Perspectives paper in 2008. Because there's a coming together of a party scholar and a political theorist in Ingrid and Mike. And they basically say that these two communities of scholars are talking past each other. So their criticism is that the party scholars dismiss the deliberative stuff as largely irrelevant, and the deliberative theorists say that the big problem is the parties. The parties are in the way, you know. That's the evil of democracy for many of them that needs to be resolved. So they're not exactly bosom pals, if you like. And so the question then is, so what? You know, there is evidence I can present, but what would a Peter Mair or a Dick Katz or many of you in this room perhaps want to say about it? So I want to make 3 points, and I'll be as quick as I can. One is, I think so what, because it's happening. And it's happening, as I'll show you now in a minute, on a large scale. Secondly, because I think citizens actually rather like it. And thirdly, because I think there is now some growing evidence that politicians are starting to see the potential. So, quickly, it's happening. Here's a very well-considered report by the OECD that's recently been updated. They published the original report a little over a year ago. They talk about the deliberative wave. So these are government-sponsored deliberative mini-publics in the OECD. There's over 500. There's just shy of 600 of these things. And look at where the series really starts to take off. You know, Ireland is 2011 when the government sets up its, or 2012 I should say, when the government sets up its first one. So Ireland is really on the cusp of the wave. And, you know, if I had the time, I'd go in chapter and verse into the amount of times that my colleagues and I have talked to the French, the European Union, the Germans, the Italians, the Poles, for guidance and advice on how we did it and what they could do in their countries when they were thinking about it. So it's happening on a grand scale. Here's a really good project that Jean-Benoit Pillet is running, the Politicized Project. And this is just looking at the European cases. So they got 112 cases in their sample. And, you know, if you look at that, it would suggest quite a large number of cases. But, you know, when I presented a version of this to the other project that Luciano was involved with, the point was made that, you know, outside of the United Kingdom and Denmark, most of these cases are subnational and not exactly, that many of them. But there's a few points. One, this data set is full of holes, and the authors know that. They've done their best to try and gather as many cases as possible. And the other is it's impossible to keep up. It's absolutely impossible to keep up. Almost every day on my Twitter feed, I'm learning of a new citizens' assembly somewhere. In the UK alone, there were 13 in their data set. There have been 35 or 40 in the last 4 years, citizens' assemblies at local, right down to the municipal level, at subnational and at national level. So these things have really started to erupt. And these are sort of, in the politicized data set, these are the different kinds. And I just wanted to show you this because, you know, deliberative mini-publics come in all sorts of weird and wonderful forms. But the gold standard most accept are the citizens' assembly because these are large, long-lasting and produce major reports. And they have 40. When I wrote a first cross-national paper on this about 7 or 8 years ago, there had only been 5 cases. The two Canadian, the Dutch case, and the 2 Irish cases. There are 40 in their data set, and they're now way out of date. So the Citizens' Assembly has really erupted on the scene. So it's much, much more prominent. So it's here, it's happening, is my first point. The second is that the citizens like it. So, you know, life often begins, I think for me at least, in this argument, and here I'm only just citing a flavour of the pieces, but Hibbins and Thies Morris's stealth Democrats sort of argument, you know, voters really can't be bothered, or as we would say in Ireland, they can't be arsed. You know, there's more important things than being involved in politics, so let others get on with it. This is sort of the world of, you know, the technocrats and all of that kind of stuff. But it's been shown by others that that actually, you know, when you really give citizens a chance to learn more about these things, they do rather like it. And Neblo et al.'s research in the United States is very authoritative on this, as some of you may have seen their various pieces on this. And they strongly dispute the findings of Hibbins and Thies Morris using the same kind of questions, but having citizens who've been involved in real-world processes that they've run themselves. And we know from other evidence, we know from evidence on referendums where there had been citizens' assemblies involved in the lead up to the referendums, both in Ireland and more generally, that they have a positive impact on the vote. I can go into that in the Q&A. We know from more recent survey experiments, and this is just a sample of these, where the respondents are given a sort of vignette on what a citizen's deliberative process is like, that they express strong approval for these sort of things. So the point that not all citizens are willing to engage doesn't necessarily carry force. The other kind of point that might be made about citizens is that they're not equally capable. This is the classic debate in voting studies, that if you look at the demographics, there are some citizens who are more capable than other citizens in terms of electoral behaviour. And a lot of the early research seemed to bear that out in the case of deliberation. But the bulk of that early research preceded deliberative mini-publics. It was research on deliberation in juries. You only have to see the 12 Angry Men to know that deliberation in citizens' juries is not exactly an ideal test of the model of deliberation. But we know from extensive research that's been done on deliberative mini-publics, particularly coming up with really good measures of the quality of the deliberative process, that the citizens are capable. And there's lots of anecdotal stories I can tell you if you give me enough drinks later, I can go into it, that back that up. So anecdotally, but certainly in terms of data that studies like this show, it can be backed up. So that's my second point, if you like. The citizens like it would be the way I put it. And the third is that the politicians are starting to see the potential. So cherry picking. That's been the accusation that's made, and I've made it and others have made it. There's no doubt cherry picking happens. What I mean by cherry picking, it's the politicians say, yeah, that recommendation we like, we'll take that one, thanks. No, we don't like that one, so we just put that one on the shelf. It does happen, but the point is it doesn't always happen. And is this unique to deliberative mini-publics? I mean, don't politicians cherry pick a little from their manifestos when they go into government? Isn't there a certain amount of, we'll promise this, but what are we going to deliver at the other end? So should we necessarily tar DMPs out, particularly in that regard? But I think more significantly, it's what's happening now. It's the process of embedding. And these are just a couple of the examples that are best known. But I want to try and put it in terms of a slide. These are three prominent examples of embedded deliberative mini-publics that we're now seeing evolve in a number of cases. So this is what's called the Us-Belgian model. This was Eve, the colleague I mentioned earlier on, whose surname I never pronounced, sorry Eve. Myself, Graham Smith and a few others were invited by the German Community Parliament in Belgium, in East Belgium, to advise them on the establishment of a permanent citizens' assembly. And they went ahead and set it up. They took the framework that we proposed and they set it up. So what they've done is they've set up this permanent body whose role is to set the agenda, come up with ideas. And the Parliament of the German-speaking community is obliged under the process that they set up to receive the report, consider the report, not ignore it, and where they disagree, call the members of the Citizens' Assembly in to meet with them to debate it. So that process is now up and running. And the same process has just been set up in Paris. The city government of Paris have just set up virtually the same the same system. Here's a second one. This is what you see in the Parliament of Brussels, where they've set up a mixed deliberative committee, and a lot of other places are now looking at that with some interest. So this is where it's possible for people to initiate a demand that the relevant technical committee of a parliament include a random selection of citizens in their ranks to debate a piece of legislation that's going through the committee. And again, the same sort of thing, the committee proper is obliged to take on board the recommendations, and if they disagree, have a discussion about where and why they disagree. And that's ongoing, that's up and running. And then a third one is the Irish one, which is now, because it's in its fifth iteration, is showing all the signs of embedding. And so what has emerged in Ireland is, here's what happened on the abortion topic. The Parliament had spent 38 years trying to resolve the conundrum of the ban on abortion. The only way they could think of doing it eventually was to say, okay, we'll set up a citizens' assembly and ask it to come up with some recommendations. And we will commit to having an all-party committee consider those recommendations and come back to the Parliament. And that's exactly what happened. That whole process took a best part of about 2 years, and it was followed by a referendum. So in essence, what you've got there are parties buying into deliberation through the deliberative mini-publics. In each of those instances, it's party politicians through their parliamentary process that have bought into the notion of real-world deliberative mini-publics that they can work with, that they will not ignore, that they will listen to. And so my final bit, and I'll try and get through this quite quickly, is the bit that I really would like to move into now, which is, okay, parties are prepared to do it in government and in the parliamentary arena. Are they prepared to do it within their own party ranks, within their own organizational ranks? So that's my second and final question. What about the parties? So going back to Van Biesen and Sayward's piece, if you ask many of the deliberative theorists or practitioners, they'll say the parties are the problem. So David van Rijbroek, the Belgian political public intellectual, published a book against elections in which he proposed that the Senate of every country should be a sortition chamber. You do away with your second chamber and replace it with a random selection of ordinary citizens. Hélène Landemore, in her really well-regarded book published, I think a year or two ago now, said you should just get rid of parties altogether, get rid of Parliament, and just have a huge citizens' assembly and lots of other little citizens' assemblies. Much as I like both of those people, that's madness. And I think most of us, of the kind of group I would hang out with, would argue that that's not the way to go. What I was outlining in the previous slide is really the more prominent example of a way to go. But it's this kind of work. It's the kind of work by Jan Tirole and Fabio Wolkenstein and Piero Ignazzi that I think is really attracting my interest right now. There may be others, but these are the three most prominent. Wolkenstein in particular, he's got a load of stuff in this space, where they're looking at the potential for deliberative parties. And to varying degrees, what all three share in common is an argument that this would be good for democracy and it would be good for parties. So I'll try and come back to that at the end. But so they theorize about it, particularly Wolkenstein in some detail. But are we seeing any evidence of it so far? So where are we in terms of practice? So the best work on this is the books by Susan Scarrow and Annika Gauja, these absolutely superb studies that were published a few years ago. And the best data, of course, is the data produced by Scarrow and my former compatriots, Thomas Baguntka and Paul Webb, the Political Party Database Project. If you've not come across it, it's an absolutely amazing resource. And it's all up on the Dataverse now. And this is just some summary trends from the latest round that they only published a few months ago. And you can see what will be familiar to many of you, and some of these topics have come up already today. What you're seeing there are great example of internal party reforms that are focused on the aggregative issue, giving members a vote on candidates, on leadership, on manifesto design and things like that. So it's aggregative issues that are really prominent in terms of the reforms, not deliberation. The second thing you're seeing, and red is sort of giving you a clue of some of that, is moving beyond members. So to varying degrees, Susan talks about it in her book about multi-speed membership. The parties are beginning to varying degrees now to open up, to move beyond their members, to looking at supporter groups. Some of this is shown in the second of the two things I wanted to show you from the Political Party Database Project data. That you can see here again that they're trying to involve friends and supporters in various ways, and some sort of deliberation, but very rudimentary, really. That you can put comments on the website, that kind of thing. But nothing really along the lines of the sort of deliberative process that Walkenstein and others are talking about. So really where the game is in terms of contemporary examples is here. It's the digital, or as they're also known, platform parties. And here particularly it's Gerbaudo's work. That book I only discovered myself a few months ago is I find it a superb book on the digital parties, but also a very good edited volume that was produced more recently. And by digital parties, in Gerbaudo's case, he's talking about Podemos, Five Star Movement, and the Pirates. But they're using the language of platforms, so they're, the analogy is to Facebook and Uber and all of those sort of things. So you're not dealing with members, you're dealing with a super base that includes stealth supporters, the people who sort of dip in and dip out of the website, but they still appear on your records, and super volunteers, the ones who are prepared to do the extra work, but they're not paying a membership due. You're seeing a lot of use of online, great platforms to make sure that everyone can be involved in picking leaders and candidates and everything, but extremely top-down, not in the slightest bit democratic, very much controlled by the leadership, and very little evidence of deliberation. So the only examples I've been able to find are these ones in these recent studies, and they're very small scale, and they're very Belgian. It's what you'd expect, given that Belgium is where a lot of the activity is happening in terms of deliberative processes, but not exclusively. There are a couple of other examples as well. So it's happening, but it's really happening on a small scale. And this is the frustrating bit. This is where I'm ending. So I'm ending with a series of questions that I'm trying to pose for myself, but I wouldn't mind if you have the heart to have a discussion before we all go for a well-deserved drink about this. So the potential is there, and as I said, that the parties are showing an openness to this in terms of the use of deliberative mini-publics. So is it such a stretch for us to conceive of the political parties, including the mainstream parties, starting to think about doing this internally for themselves? Would it work in practice? Well, the sort of arguments I can imagine immediately that come up is, come on, David, be realistic. It would make parties unelectable. That'd be sort of the May's Law kind of argument. Do you really want a random selection of people in a party, or whatever way you want to set this thing up, trying to influence important policy decisions? What the argument is, why not? Would it make parties unelectable? Might it not be a fresh image for a party to show that it's having an open, transparent debate internally on some key policy matter? And by the way, why not think of this for the Euro parties? It'd be a wonderful device for the Euro parties to start thinking about some common manifesto or something like that they might do it in a deliberative process. Would the party leaders buy into this? Well, they bought into this in an increasing number of cases in terms of deliberative mini-publics. They're surrendering a degree of their sovereign control over a policy process in terms of important constitutional reform questions or legislative proposals that have to go through Parliament. So why should their own internal organisational dynamics be any different? Why can't party leaders buy into this? Would the members like it? That's sort of a version of the Hibbings Theismos kind of argument. Maybe it would bore voters, and party members. Well, maybe not, because we can see from the Neblo et al. Studies that voters get engaged, so why should party members be different? And Gouger's work shows very well that one of the things that party members really value is having a say, having an influence, having some kind of voice in internal dynamics. So I end here. I think it might. I think it should. Parties, Sartori and others, the linkage argument, the party democracy argument, are key transmission belts. So why should we let other entities, other single interest groups and others be involved in this? Why should not the parties be picking up this mantle as well? Parties are used to trade-offs and compromise. They're continuously doing this. The promiscuity of parties, as Peter would talk about, in terms of coalition arrangements. They're prepared to trade off and compromise and accommodate. They're prepared to be flexible and move where they need to. So why not use that same richness, that same gift in their internal deliberations? Don't go in with a fixed view and a policy. Be open to the possibility that your policy will evolve in a deliberative process. And I've already made that point, members value having a say. So I can only end with this rather lame ending, which is to go back to what I was saying about coming out of the academy, that a bunch of deliberative democracy political scientists have been making this push for the use of processes like this in terms of the legislative process, and this is starting to gather some traction. So wouldn't I say naively, wouldn't it be nice if party scholars would also try and engage in this? If I got the funding for this Horizon project, one of the things I would love to do would be to work with a party or two on some real-world internal deliberative processes within the parties, and maybe try and sell the idea to them. But that's where I leave it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, David, for this very refreshing, despite the heat in the room, lecture. I think that Peter may have or not agree with you, but I think he would be happy with the conclusion. As we know, he passed from being very positive to very negative towards political parties in what our colleague Sheldon Jedi called, the Copernican turn, right? But I think, clearly there is a positive view here that, parties are still, necessary, Schuman once says, no, democracy saves in terms of parties. And I think, this is clearly something that Peter would agree with, and Peter would be happy to listen. So now I would like to open the floor. So please, Sana. Thank you, Sana. It's okay if we collect a couple?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, very good. So, Vaiva.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting to listen to it. I'm also not familiar particularly with this strand of literature, but for that reason, maybe I have such questions. You showed shortly a graph which showed several countries having these initiatives. I wonder what parties tend to initiate this deliberative process. Are there any common characteristics of these parties which tend to do it? So is there some kind of commonality, what you can observe, which parties tend to initiate such a process, and what conditions they do so? Has there something been in literature which has studied these two things? Thank you.
Thank you, Vaiva. Crystal.
Yeah, two questions. First of all, I was wondering if you could say a few words about how party ideology fits into all of this. Would it be a constraint on the use of these mini publics, or would parties just do these sort of experiments with, say, their own members, and would the idea then be that that sort of means that there is a particular sort of ideological mindset that can't really conflict with the ideology of the party? Or would it be that you only do them in sort of areas where there is no clear party position, or so? Is that where the potential is? And secondly, I was wondering what the implications of all of these are for the popular element of democracy. Because I guess sort of directly speaking, you just say involving, you've got maybe sort of 100 people or so on these mini publics, and that may be very insightful, but it's of course a very small part of the So are the implications also for popular democracy different across these different uses of the mini-publics that you refer to? So for instance, would you argue that the Irish case, where the experiment, if you wish, is followed by a referendum, that is sort of where the popular element is really boosted? What is happening there, I guess my question is.
We will take one more because I still have another round of 4 or 5. So, Caterina, please.
Thanks, Fernando. Thanks, David. That's a fascinating project. And I have just maybe 2 comments for you. And so my first comment is about the possibility to reconcile, deliberation processes that are based on a sort of horizontal way of formulating proposals and taking decisions, and parties' ways of formulating decisions that is more vertical, right? Historically, and in this respect, I would like to know, in studying and conceptualizing the potential for deliberative parties, how important is this compromise between horizontality and verticality of decision-making? My second question is about the role of social movements in deliberative practices and their interactions with political parties. So, for example, if I think about, like the citizens' assemblies that we had in France before the elections after the Yellow Vest movement, actually Macron's party jumped on the bandwagon after social movements started setting this type of citizens' meetings. So I wonder whether there is a room for social movements in your model. And I'm afraid I have a third question or comment. In your theory, are you thinking about some differences between different party families, or also between mainstream and radical parties? Because, for example, if I think about radical left parties, many of these parties, again, I'm very influenced by the French context, but many of these parties, like for the last elections at least, they have set their programs based on citizens' assemblies that were actually headed by local neighborhood associations. So I wonder whether, you are thinking about differentiating deliberative practices inside mainstream parties and inside more radical ones. But it's a fascinating project, and good luck with it.
Thank you. I'm not going to do justice to these, but I will try my best. Sana, was you asking about how to bind the leadership? Yeah, I'm glad that this and another question was raised. What Wolkenstein and others, and I agree with them, say is that really to run these processes most effectively, you really should focus on the members. If you want to reinvigorate the parties, you want to reinvigorate the members. So you want to make membership a thing of value for people to make the effort to join. That this could be, one of the ways to try and stem the problem of declining membership. So the sort of practice we're seeing with the digital parties is not something that many would approve of, where you're using these platforms and supporter groups. And if you're doing that, if you're involving the party members, then for it to be meaningful and for it to make the effort for them to do it, you should follow the practice that deliberative mini-publics follow, which is a government says we want a citizens' assembly on abortion. We're going to give that to a body that we're going to set up to run it, and we're not going to run it ourselves. And the same practice should happen within the parties, that they should set up some body, and you said that there probably already is, you know more than I do by the sounds of it, of the parties you're talking about, that there's some unit or agency within the party that has a degree of autonomy. You can imagine with the stratarchical membership kind of a model that could well be the case, and that it's that unit that should run it. The leadership should not have influence over it. They should accept the outcome of that. That's my attempt to try and answer that one. Baber and one of Katrina's questions were asking about which parties are supportive and whether there are certain kinds of party families. It's early days, but I think there's sort of 2 answers to that. One is, if you look at the British case, it's the parties of the left. If Labour had won the critical election a few years ago, we would have had a citizens' assembly on the future of British democracy, because they had promised that they would do it if they had got elected, but they didn't. The Conservatives won't touch it. They're not interested. That's one answer, but the other answer is in Ireland, the very first process I talked about, the Convention on the Constitution, 1/3 of its membership were representatives of every single political party on the island of Ireland, proportionate to their size, and every party, with the exception of the Northern Ireland Unionists, sent representatives to that. And crucially, when it came up with the recommendations on abortion, on marriage equality, all the parties agreed with that. So it took party politics out of the equation, but they all bought into it. So, but it's early days. There aren't enough examples for me to say categorically if we can have any, clear sense of which parties are supportive. I can only give you anecdote. Christelle was talking about party ideology. I suppose that's a version of that, is it? I'm not quite sure I remember what that question was. It was.
How it features into all of this, and if this deliberative democracy cannot be a challenge from a perspective of sort of consistency on ideology.
Oh yeah, so I suppose it would be a question of you probably want to pick your topic very carefully. So the same point applies in the case of deliberative mini-publics. The point that Ken Carty always makes is you would not want to fly an airplane designed by a citizens' assembly. So you've got to pick your topics. So abortion's a good one, marriage equality is a good one, the climate is a good one. Topics that have a normative underpinning or something around which a certain emotion might develop. And I could imagine you could apply that sort of logic in the case of internal deliberations within parties, probably depending on what family they're in, but parties of the left might want to debate certain social policy issues. I don't know, parties on the right might want to debate issues to do with immigration or something. You can imagine how that might play out, but that's just an attempt to answer that. I really like that question about horizontal versus vertical. I don't have a clear answer on that, but I like that. So thank you for raising that, and I'll dwell on that. And social movements have a really important role. Extinction Rebellion, I've been calling for citizens' assemblies from the get-go, and it's one of the things that influenced Macron to go ahead and set this thing up in France. And by the way, they talked to us before they set it up. They had a whole bunch of people come over and talk to the Irish about it before they went ahead. Unfortunately, they didn't listen to the advice about the need to take account of the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly. They ignored them to a large degree. So social movements can have an extremely important role, and the key is not to ignore them. So the process should be inclusive. So what always happens in the Irish case is that the social movements are invited into the room to give their views on whichever side of the debate it would be, so that their voice is also heard in trying to influence the debates of the citizens. I think that's my best to go.
Thank you. So no COVID policies discussing, citizens' assemblies, right?
COVID.
Yeah,
that'd be one.
Okay, so we have 2 rounds of still. So Eduardo goes now.
Well, thanks for your presentation. Very nice to meet you. I was wondering, you gave several examples of deliberative democracy at the national level. You mentioned, unless I was constructive, the Conference on the Future of Europe,
Yeah.
which is, of course, a massive endeavor in that respect, which is issuing concrete proposals for actions. Now, many pundits are writing badly about the results of the conference. What do you make of it? Also, the live your talk.
Wojciech.
Yes, so I still have this big question about the normative thing between representative democracy and deliberative democracy. And I still see this contradiction in terms. So would you say that you're trying to improve representative democracy by bringing in some kind of element of deliberative democracy, or you kind of try to synthesize both? And then I think this is quite important in selling the project, because the second question I had would be what kind of leaders you would expect, party leaders would be willing to go for such a risky strategy, because I can think about many risks you can mention. So what kind of leaders you would expect? So one avenue Catherine asked about was left wing, right wing, wherever. But do you see any other characteristics of leaders or parties that would be more likely to, under what conditions they would think it would somehow bring them positive results wherever this positive result would be? And third, what about, again, following these questions about the role of social movements, what about the link between those, participatory budgeting initiatives as well,
Thank you, Wojciech. Kevin.
Yeah, thanks a lot. This actually builds very closely on what Wojciech just said, so I will be shorter. So kind of one element that I'm wondering about is if you talk about these deliberative mini-publics outside of parties, right? So one of the questions is why would political elites in general give away power, in a sense, to these mini-publics? And I think there were a number of answers, potential answers to this question in your presentation and also in some of your answers, right? So there are specific policy areas probably that we would expect specific elites to be more, likely to delegate to these assemblies, and there is probably also something to say about the types of parties, ideologically speaking. But then I'm wondering if we kind of carry on this logic and wonder about what does this mean then in terms of how this would work within a party, and take on board one other dimension that we have not addressed yet, which is what are the conditions under which the recommendations coming out of these mini-publics are likely to be adopted. So what is then the effect of this on, kind of the balance of power within parties? Because it seems to me, one of the things that kind of normatively that you seem to be pushing for is to kind of reinvigorate parties, make members more important in parties. And I'm wondering if that's actually the effect, if we take all of these different steps together, right? Somebody sets the agenda on a specific set of topics. This is probably specific to party families in terms of their ideology. And then there is another step in terms of how likely is it that these kinds of things will actually be adopted. So that is kind of a question for the scope, the potential of this entire mechanism specific on conditions. And what I'm particularly wondering about is whether we know anything from the kind of mini-publics research in terms of what are these conditions empirically that make things more or less likely to be adopted, right? Is it always something that is in line anyway with the ideological predispositions of the people who organize these assemblies, right? That would be a kind of a rather cynical way of seeing these things. Thank you.
David, we still have another round, and will be the last one, but please.
Okay, thanks. Eduardo was talking about the Conference on the Future of Europe. As you will know, but others may not have heard, at its heart were 4 citizens' panels, which were multinational citizens' assemblies, 200-member citizens' assemblies looking at a whole series of topics. There were other aspects involving citizens. One of the citizens' panels had one of their meetings in Dublin, so I was able to sit in on it and watch it. And it was quite extraordinary to see 200 citizens with different language capabilities, having translation services from people remotely, and it was seamless. There were certain facets of this that were superb. But as your question implies, there were certain facets that were not. Very top-down, very badly designed in terms of the breadth, the broadness of the topics that were to be covered, and not enough time to do it properly, and no clarity, which comes up in one of the later questions, no clarity about what happens at the end. So in many ways it was a failure in terms of how to run these things, but some of us would, with sort of a glass half full, would say at least it showed the potential, and the potential that they can do it better, and certainly the reality that we now know they can do it in a multilingual context without any difficulty. That was the revelation for me, that language barriers was just not there. It really worked in that regard, but a lot more to do. So that then gets to your question, Wojciech, if I don't pronounce your name, sorry. I'll have to practice it later with you. I beg your pardon, I have to practice it later with you over a few drinks. So your first question is, what's the role what's the mission for representative democracy? The person who I'd be most closely attached to here is Mark Warren, the political theorist Mark Warren, who has been making this point now for a decade or more, that these democratic innovations, of which these ones he particularly is taken by, are there to be an add-on to the ecology of representative democracy. So they're not there to replace, they're not there to reduce, they're there to just provide support where support might be helpful, but nothing more than that. And I think many of us would buy into that sort of sense. You asked a question about it's a risky strategy, so it's a risky strategy for the leader. Yeah, but the thing is, there are party leaders who are already going down that road. In British Columbia, it was the the Premier, who had made a manifesto promise that if elected he would have a citizens' assembly to debate the electoral system, because he had lost the previous election even though his party had more votes because of the crazy first past the post system. And he said that we'll have a debate about our electoral system, but it'll be done by ordinary citizens, not by the politicians, because turkeys don't vote for Christmas. And he followed through on that. Unfortunately, it didn't pass a referendum, but very narrowly it didn't pass it. And much the same in the Irish and all the other examples. It's a Prime Minister who sort of says, we can't solve this abortion topic, or there is a crying need for us to come to grips with the marriage equality debate, and we're not managing to get this through Parliament. So we need to take it out of the heat of party politics for a bit of time and become educated from listening to ordinary citizens and let them educate us and hold our hands so that we might be prepared to go the extra mile. And that's effectively what happened. I think that, and then basically the participatory budgeting thing. So this is what sort of topics would they be prepared to give? I mean, the new permanent Citizens' Assembly for Paris includes participatory budgeting. It'll be a Citizens' Assembly that will have a say in an aspect of the budgeting for the council. That's what's written into the plan, at least. I suppose I'm going to give a version of the answer I gave already, which is not everything will work. We've had a couple of citizens' assemblies that were disasters. We had one that discussed whether we should have fixed-term parliaments in Ireland, because currently our Prime Minister calls the election. And so for some reason nobody understands, the politicians said, let's give that to the Citizens' Assembly to discuss. And a quarter of the members never turned up. The journalists didn't turn up. And I think 8 members of the public submitted comments. It had no interest to anybody. That should not have been a topic for discussion for a Citizens' Assembly. So it's value-laden, big, hot topic type things are the best, but not only those. Kevin, why would leaders give away power? I'm still getting used to people, I beg your pardon. Why would leaders give away? Well, but this is the point, they are. In a gradually growing number of cases, party leaders are basically saying, okay, we're going to give this a go. And there's risks associated with this. I mean, the abortion topic could have been a major car crash for the Prime Minister who called it, because the Prime Minister, Enda Kenny, the leader of the Fine Gael party, was against abortion. No way would they have countenanced a referendum to change the abortion legislation. And what followed was a referendum, not only to get rid of the ban on abortion, but basically to say there should be no restriction anywhere in the Constitution on this. It should be for the Parliament to decide. And that's because the Citizens' Assembly said that's the way to do it. So they listened to the advice. So it's risky, and you can imagine there could be car crashes, but it does seem to be something that leaders are prepared to do. And then what chance that their recommendations will be accepted? I think that's what I was trying to get at with that little diagram at the end, that the best chance is to have very clear guidelines given into what happens next. So Mark Warren is right that these things should not replace. These things are there to augment and help and support. But that is predicated on the idea that at least the politicians are going to listen. They don't have to accept, but they must be prepared to listen. They mustn't ignore, they mustn't insult by kicking it into the long grass. They must debate with the members, so that if they disagree with the members, they must explain where and how they disagree with them and be open to the possibility through that deliberation of changing their minds again. So it's as we develop that output side. So, the language often used is input, throughput, and output. And the deliberative process as a throughput is run extremely well. We know how to run a deliberative mini-public. It's the agenda setting side and what to do with the recommendation side that we're still learning, but we're seeing a growing number of cases of where it's working.
I'm very aware of the time, so please, those who have to ask questions, be very brief. Davide?
Thank you very much for the presentation, and I learned a lot, and it really made me think a lot, and also about recent developments, last 10 years of politics in Italy, for example. And so I have a question, and I apologize if maybe it's not fully relevant for this, but I think about the use of the term deliberative democracy and how it has also been perhaps misused by some parties and party movements, and I'm referring to the 5-Star Movement, for example, in Italy. And the fact that they also used a lot this concept of meetups at the local level, bottom-up development of party programs and so on. So how do you see these experiments that obviously failed, but because they weren't really deliberative democracy, but they used a bit this rhetoric, and there are perhaps other examples of new parties, that also digital parties that used digital resources. And so, yeah, that's my question about these party movements.
Nina.
Yeah, rather very quick. Two short comments. The first one is how all of this how all of this fits into the increasingly technical nature of a lot of policy areas. I saw very briefly on your slide biodiversity, which is not technical as such, as a value, but in order to gain, increase biodiversity, that would mean regulating forestry, the use of land, use of carbon sinks and so on, which are very, very complex policy matters. So that's my first just comment. And the second one is, I didn't see on your slides, at least I wouldn't say the attempts, well maybe there are attempts by the European Commission to engage in dialogue with citizens. Last month I had the pleasure to meet Executive Vice President of the Commission, Frans Timmermans, together with 4 MPs, and he was very happy to be there, but then he rushed away because he was going to a citizen dialogue on the streets of Stockholm, which was full of people asking questions about climate policies. So I just wanted to compliment this project, but I was just missing these attempts that are taking place by semi-non-majoritarian institutions to engage directly with citizens and bypassing parties.
Thank you, Nina. Evelyn.
Thanks. I'll be very brief. This is fascinating, and it's more by now two-finger comments, because many things have already been asked about the ideological aspect, and also to what extent this is replacing party democracy. And I'm very happy to hear this is actually not meant to replace it, but to add. But my question is more context related to the Irish political sphere. So, do you see any sort of link with the increase in independent candidates that are populating the Irish Parliament, and let's say increase or the use or the flourishing of these citizens' assemblies? So, do you think? I mean, maybe this is far-fetched, but you have a lot of independent candidates, and they do get quite some vote share. And is this sort of a disincentive for people to invest in party politics from the bottom up, or are these completely different processes and complementary?
Last but not least, George.
Thank you. This was interesting. I would like to ask you a couple of questions. So the first, my first concern about this is ex post accountability. So that is, parties have fulfilled this sort of, so they keep their brand and they have this long-term existence, right? So once a citizens' assembly disbands and some decision comes out of it, what happens if, who takes the fall if 2 or 3 years down the line the decision has some unexpected or unwanted effects? So I'm sort of concerned with retrospective accountability. So if people are not happy, who are they going to take the blame for? And well, I guess party leaders would have to adopt the deliberations, of course, but then party leaders might, in a way, blame shift. Oh, you know, I really didn't want this, but I took the wishes, or I accepted the preferences from the citizens' assembly, and here I am. And in the end, no one really takes the blame. And this could, in a way, from a different, with very different motivations, this would become a non-majoritarian institution. So, and all the critiques that we make to non-majoritarian institutions would apply. So, it's a very different road going in, but the output is the same, because at the end of the day, non-majoritarian institutions happen to be there, and you can sack the governor or, the Federal Reserve chairman or whatever. But once the assembly is disbanded, who is there to take responsibility? And that's my sort of key concern in terms of this thing.
David,
I'm
the
really
last
not
word
going
is
to do,
yours.
these are great questions, so please forgive me for not doing them justice. Davide, your question about the five-star movement. My understanding from Gerbaudo's book is that, and in fact the other book on digital parties also looks at the five-star movement, is that it's tokenistic deliberation is what you're seeing. It's very tightly controlled by the leadership. There's very little opportunity for the support base to have any real say in the deliberative process. It's very tightly controlled, so it's just not done properly. And the way for it to be done is, going back to an answer to one of the other questions, to try and take the leadership, the control of that out of the leadership, and give some other entity within the party some say over how to steer it so that it can have a meaningful way. So we're not seeing it yet. And Italy is proving to be a case where generally deliberative mini-publics really haven't taken root. I gave a talk in the Parliament in Rome a few years ago. There was a bunch of colleagues who were trying to promote the idea in Italy, and nobody paid it any attention. So it never happened in Italy, as far as I can see. I can't remember. You were asking about the biodiversity example, isn't that right? As an example, yeah. It sort of goes back, because actually when on a platform in Scotland before the Scottish Citizens Assembly, I made the Ken Carty joke about flying an airplane and all that. And sitting next to me was this really well-known scholar in the field, Oliver Escobar, who said, David, you're wrong. Because you wouldn't ask a Citizens Assembly to design an airplane. You'd ask it questions like, what can you do to deal with the climate agenda? Should you go for small planes? Should you go for large planes? Should you go for fast, slow? Should you go for a new kind of fuel? You can imagine the sort of way you could parse it down into a whole series of questions, and then you give those questions to Citizens Assembly. And it hasn't been done well, but we've seen it with the climate assemblies in France and in the UK Climate Assembly also, that they found a device, not a good one, but it was an attempt at least, to break it down into manageable chunks and basically look at those aspects. And I can imagine this biodiversity one, which has only met once so far, that's what they'll do. They'll say, okay, we're going to discuss forestry now. Let's see if we can come up with some way we're going to address this and whether we'll come forward with ideas. So there is a way of breaking it up, but I still hold to the line that the topics that work best are those where you can get a little bit of a normative underpinning. That seems to work quite well. I wasn't quite sure I followed the discussion about the Commission.
My comment was how, if you see any complementary value with deliberative institutions rather than deliberative parties. An example I wanted to make was how the Commission repeatedly, very, very often, engage in these public hearings.
Yeah.
I think they call them dialogues, but it is a way of deliberation. And my example I made was Frans Timmermans going to the streets of Stockholm, discussing the 55 package, rather than spending more time with MPs.
Yeah.
So this was example.
Yeah, no, I was an expert witness for one of the citizens panels, and I was asked to come up with some suggestions about how a deliberative process might work in a future European Union. And that was one of the ideas, which I got from, I forgot his name now, oh, it's going to annoy me, it'll come up later, was you could imagine where the Commission might commission a deliberative panel to engage in a dialogue, a structured deliberative dialogue about an issue that they're considering before they initiate the legislation. So there are ways in which you could quite easily fit this in, probably without the need for a treaty change. It could be done. Okay, I may not have given that. Evelyn was talking about, oh yeah, the independence. It doesn't really. We've in every parliament in the history of our state we have independence, and they rise and they fall. So they have been rising, but they're now falling again. If you look at the opinion polls, their numbers are going down. So the pattern continues. So I wouldn't see the existence of independence being a feature. For me, the clue to why, I think the main reason why Ireland has adopted so many of these things is that very first one, the convention. Because as I said, it included, you know, the leader of the Sinn Féin party, Mary Lou MacDonald, was a member of that. The chairperson, the Speaker of our Parliament, was a member. We've had several government ministers who were members. So we have people still in our Parliament today from all of the political parties who have first-hand experience of these things, and that's why they've all bought into it, because they know how it works. So they become ambassadors for it. It was just an accident of the design of how they did it. So I think that would be the main reason why it's happened. I don't see the independents playing a role there. And then, George, you're talking about, I guess, a retrospective accountability in non-majoritarian institutions. I guess my answer there would be to say that, again, sort of channeling Mark Warren, I'd be saying that these things, if they have any say, it is to recommend, is to express an informed opinion, but they don't have a decision-making role. So there has to be some decision-making process that follows. So in the deliberative legislative process, deliberative mini publics in the legislative process, it'll go to a parliamentary committee. In the Citizens Initiatives Review in Oregon, it goes to the citizens to vote on in a referendum. So the decision is that, it's the recommendation that they're considering. And I would see much the same apply if you had this within a party, that it would be, the party must not ignore it, they must treat it with respect, they must engage in a debate with the outcome of that process, but if they fundamentally disagree, they disagree, and they have to be transparent about that, and that's fine. They're not required to accept it. And in terms of the non-majoritarianism, I think that would address some of that, because they're only making recommendations. But the other way to address it is that it's permanent in the Ost-Belgian case, only insofar as there's this entity called a Citizens' Council, but its membership rotates every 6 months. A third of its membership is replaced by people who are involved in a Citizens' Assembly. So it's continuously renewing its membership. I think I've done.
Okay, thank you very much. Once again, I'm the only one between you and the food and the drinks. You mentioned the drinks a couple of times. I think that your subconscious was,
Not subconscious.
Yes. So, I just want to say one thing. Richard Katz once says that Peter Mair was one of the great political science working in English as Irish, right? So after, listening to your presentation, knowing your work, I think that we all agree that Ireland is clearly, a promised land for great political scientists. Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, everybody, and those online.